So Maple Leafs 2 points back of those Bruins who have been super unlucky, as we just mentioned. The Leafs taking advantage of that because they're 2 points back. They have 4 games in hand, so very much, not just in the playoff conversation, on pace to make the playoffs. And you mentioned that brutal Metro division. Leafs don't play in it, and they take advantage of playing in the Atlantic, which is a totally different ball game. I think in watching this team day in, day out, play good teams and play them pretty well, and I know lose a point in Washington to that Capitals team, but they very much should have had 2 points in that game, and they beat them already this season. They played good teams well. I don't think anybody would be shocked to see this team in a playoff position now, but it all depends on what happens at the trade deadline, in my opinion here, Elliotte, and I imagine in a lot of people's as well, and whether or not they move on from guys like JVR and Bozak, and I don't expect them to be adding pieces. Like, that's what's ruined this franchise for 50 years. There's no short-term thinking this year. But maybe, do you think the proximity to the playoffs maybe pushes a decision like a JVR, like a Tyler Bozak to the offseason, and they'd really have to be wowed at the deadline to move either of those guys?
Well, I think there's some truth to that, Ben. I think the thing with JVR is my thing with him is that your decision on JVR is probably determined by whether or not you can sign him. If you think you're signing JVR, then or you're keeping him long term, then that probably makes your decision for you. If not, you since he's going into the last year of his deal, I think that's. I think that probably answers your question as to when it is. Is it now or is it the summer? And, Bozak's in a similar situation. I look at it this way. This is a bonus this year, but I think when you're a team, and this is where a team has to be careful, you can look at it from an organizational standpoint and say, it's not the end of the world if we don't make the playoffs this year, but one thing I've learned covering sports over the years is that it matters to your players. And, you're sitting here with Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner and Morgan Riley and these guys who are going to be their key part of your team, you hope, for forever and ever, amen. And you send them the message that, hey, making the playoffs this year isn't that important to us because we're still in the middle of a rebuild. You never want to give your players an excuse to think that winning doesn't matter to you. So I don't necessarily think the Leafs are going to go out and get someone. I agree with you that they're not going to fool around with their long-term plan. Mm-hmm. But right now, Mike Babcock and Lou Lamoriello are pushing their buttons like we're in a playoff race. You have to convince your players that it matters to you. You have to show your players that it matters to you because you never want them to think of your organization, hey, it's not important that we get in this year. You never want your players to think that. So the way I look at it, Ben, is we can look at it from outside and say, you know what, hey, they're still in year 2 of a rebuild. That's fine. But I think internally you're telling your players, guys, like Ben has just said, we're 2 points out with 4 games in hand.
They're mentioning my name specifically, I think. Lou Lamoriello knows who I am. No, absolutely.
But that's the way it goes. It's like right now you're telling your players, guys, we're in the race. And you better play like we're in the race.
Elliotte, obviously the blue line is a big issue for the Toronto Maple Leafs. If, in fact, they were serious about contending for a playoff spot, which I don't know if they are, like you just said, but who are some of the names that potentially the Leafs could be targeting, and what are the prices right now for those guys?
Well, for defensemen right now, it's expensive. You look at what Edmonton had to give up to get a defenseman last year. So if you want, that's what they're kind of doing with a guy like Van Riemsdyk, is if he goes, they're hoping it's for a defenseman. Look, and I'm just throwing this out there, I think if for any reason, like a guy like Nylander could get them a defenseman too, I wonder if they would think about it. Defensemen, the market got set by Taylor Hall for Adam Larson last year. Defensemen are very, very hard to come by. Mm-hmm. Now, when you're looking at, rental type players, I'm just trying to think like, Colorado, they're looking to keep defensemen. They're not looking to add them so much. Probably the guy who's going to get a lot of attention, and he doesn't get a lot right now, is Michael Stone in Arizona. He's an unrestricted free agent after this year. Pretty decent player. I mean, I think he's a name you're going to hear a lot. It's interesting. It sounds like a lot of teams are trying to get their hands on Brandon Carlo, the young defenseman from Boston, but so far they've resisted, Jacob Trouba and Gabriel Landeskog deals for him. So that tells you that if you want a young player or a young player with term, it's going to cost you, and it's going to cost you big. But a rental like a guy like Michael Stone, you're right. I'm not sure the Leafs will want to pay that price, because even though I think they're going for it as a team this year, they still do look at the big picture.